to the Menzies Institute for inviting me to the conference. So the victory of the Liberal and Country parties in the 1949 election had much to do with growing popular resentment about wartime economic controls, which many people thought had gone on too long. And this was only accentuated by, as we heard yesterday, the attempt to nationalise the banks. So Menzies came to power in 1949 on a platform to dismantle as much as he could wartime controls and encourage a greater degree of free enterprise. Having come to power, the two hallmarks of the Menzies government's economic policy during the Korean War period from 1950 to about 1953 were first its full acceptance of the Keynesian principles of macroeconomic management developed in the early Menzies, then the Curtin and the Chifley years. The second aspect of his management was his pragmatism in being prepared to reintroduce some controls in the economy, including some that were contrary to the government's rhetoric and its basic political instincts. And the introduction in 1952 of a comprehensive regime of import licensing, which is introduced as a temporary measure, an emergency measure, actually goes on through the whole of the 1950s. And this is the most salient example of this pragmatism. And although this is going beyond the chronological scope of this conference, the real ending of the wartime era of economic controls, which go from the 1940 through the 1950s, was with the abolition of import licensing in February 1960. And indeed, there are three measures that the Menzies government takes, first being the 1957 Commerce Agreement with Japan, second being the abolition of import licensing, and the third being the end of the iron ore export embargo at the end of 1960. These three measures taken together, I think, are comparable with the Hawke government's 1983 floating of the dollar in reorienting the Australian economy in a more open and outward direction. But going back to the Second World War, a range of economic controls are introduced and accentuated in the Second World War. Things like export controls on butter, they were introduced to make sure there's enough butter to be exported to the United Kingdom. And that in turn meant rationing of butter for Australian consumers. Import controls were also introduced early in the Second World War, and they're kept in the period after 1945 for dollar imports. And of course, during this period of the 1940s and through the 1950s, sterling, the pound sterling, is not readily convertible into the dollar. And the shortage of dollars means that there has to be rationing of certain dollar goods. And in no area was rationing more resented than petrol. So just by way of background, at the end of the Second World War, Britain comes out of the Second World War virtually bankrupt and has to go cap in hand to America to borrow $3 billion to keep its economy going. The Australian wartime experience was much more favourable because we had a good war in terms of benefiting from Lend-Lease from America and benefiting from the spending of American soldiers in Australia, which means that we build up our reserves. And unlike in the First World War, we come out of the Second World War with no debt, but rather with our international reserves enhanced. But Britain, on the other hand, has to borrow from America and accept conditions that the Americans impose, one of which is to make sterling convertible with the dollar by 1947. The British do that with disastrous consequences for their economy, and they've got to rapidly reinstate measures to stop that convertibility. Then later, 2 years later, the British economy is still suffering a shortage of dollars, and in those circumstances, Britain devalues the pound, and Australia follows suit. And Britain also institutes, again, rationing of petrol and asks Australia to do the same. So Chifley is asked by the British government to do that, and he agrees to do it. And I think this is really the straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of the coming election. Menzies promises not to introduce this rationing. He believes, as it proves rightly, that Australia doesn't need to have this rationing. He goes on to win the election in 1949. And ironically, Menzies reverses the situation in 1940 when Menzies had introduced petrol rationing as a wartime measure, and Curtin had criticised that and benefited from it. So having won the election in 1949, he successfully, Menzies does not ration petrol. Also, he goes to America in mid-1950 on a significant mission. This is just a photograph that illustrates the petrol rationing issue of 1949. But Menzies goes to America, amongst other things, to try to borrow large amounts of American dollars from America. And the World Bank agrees to this. This is a real coup for Menzies. He gets the World Bank, called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, to lend Australia $100 million, the largest ever loan extended by the World Bank to that time to Australia. And this enables Menzies to overcome some of the difficulties of the dollar shortage by being able to use the dollars to import valuable dollar goods, things like agricultural machinery and other important items, which helps Australia in turn to beef up its agricultural production. Mid-year, just as Menzies goes to America, the Korean War breaks out, and this poses a significant challenge to the Menzies government's objective of progressively dismantling the controlled economy. As the government commits Australian forces to the Korean War, Menzies is also preparing to send another expeditionary force to the Middle East in the event that a global war breaks out. So in December 1950, with a global war looking possible, he sets up a National Security Resources Board to help advise the government about balancing the civil and military economy. And one of the things that comes out of this is that, on the advice of the Treasury and the National Security Board, the government reintroduces capital controls under the Defence Preparations Act. Now, by early 1951, we're in the midst of a wool boom in Australia. This wool boom, comparatively, was bigger than the mining boom of the 2000s in terms of the terms of trade, which means the amount of things that you could buy for a given amount of imports. So there's an incredible increase in the price of wool, a lot of currency coming into the country, people are spending more, and that puts pressure on inflation. So with inflation ramping up, and Menzies has promised to, amongst other things, try to restore value to the pound, the government introduces the horror budget of 1951. It's called the horror budget because it was a brave political step to increase taxes and reduce spending. So the Commonwealth Bank raises interest rates, and Treasurer Arthur Fadden runs a budget surplus. Now, historian Greg Whitwell, who's written a major book about the Treasury, has described this budget as an event of major significance in Australia's budgetary history, for the budget represented the first explicit use of fiscal policy for anti-cyclical purposes. The budget was Keynesian in practice, principle and spirit, and openly so. And Menzies and his government benefits from the top-level officials in Treasury, led by Roland Wilson from 1951, and others like Richard Randall and younger officers such as John Stone, who joined later. Now, one, I suppose, bad consequence of the wool boom for the Menzies government is America's now in the Korean War, and it's having to clothe its troops with woolen garments, and it has to pay a higher price for wool. So in the second half of 1950, the Truman administration asked the Australian government to suspend wool auctions. And later, it wants to introduce an international scheme to allocate wool. Now, this really poses major problems for the Australian government. So wool is our major export. We export about 85% of our production of wool, and wool accounts for more than half of our external income. So this is a really detrimental measure that the Americans are proposing or asking Australia to do, just as Australia is trying to negotiate the ANZUS Treaty. So it's a delicate task that the Menzies government has to navigate. And what happens is that John McEwen, who's the Minister for Commerce and Agriculture, and his Departmental Secretary, John Crawford, helped the government to resist successfully that move, that request by America. So they're able to delicately handle it, to persuade the Americans not to do it, and at the same time go ahead and negotiate the ANZUS Treaty. But just as you have this extraordinary wool boom in 1950-51, you have then in late 1951 a precipitate dropping of the price of wool. It goes up in a tremendous way and then drops precipitately. And that means that you have much less international reserves. They're being exhausted at a rapid rate because Australians are spending more money, buying more imports, and it looks as though it might even be the case that our overseas reserves may be entirely exhausted. Now, these are the days not of floating exchange rates like we have now. Under the Bretton Woods Agreement, exchange rates are fixed. Australia's already devalued once in 1949. It doesn't want to do it again. So what can the government do? It can't risk its overseas reserves being depleted, doesn't want to devalue. What it does is it goes back to wartime precedent and looks at the import licensing that had been introduced during the Second World War and decides to reintroduce it in 1952. Across the board import licensing that applies to all imports. Now, as I said, this is regarded as a temporary expedient, but it ends up lasting for the whole of the 1950s. And it's really essential for the Menzies government's economic management because the narrow or relatively narrow basket of exportable commodities, things like wool, wheat, meat, are limited firstly. They're subject to seasonal variations. They're also subject to changes in prices. They're also, in cases like wheat, subject to unfair competition from countries like European countries and from the US in a way which introduces in 1954 a measure to help developing countries by giving them subsidised wheat. So all these things means that Australia introduces import licensing in 1952 and then has to continue it right throughout the 1950s. It's managed by the Department of Trade and Customs, one of two trade departments, and, as I said, lasts right through the 1950s. Now, I know we're pressed for time, I'll just conclude with a number of observations about import licensing. So it's run by the Department of Trade and Customs between 1952 and 1956. Then the Menzies government decides to create a Department of Trade by merging Commerce and Agriculture and Trade and Customs. Why does he do that? he wants to put one of his most capable ministers, probably the most capable after Menzies, in charge of import licensing, because it's such an important job. Previously, it had been managed by the Minister for Trade and Customs. Secondly, he wants John Crawford, the Departmental Secretary, to be the public servant administering the scheme. So they take it on from 1956 and they keep it going until 1960. In 1960, Harold Holt wants to get rid of import licensing because inflation's having an uptick again. He wants to get rid of licensing to soak up the inflation, and he thinks we're ready for the end of licensing. Crawford says, no, that's too fast, that's too precipitate, be cautious, don't move so fast. But Holt and the Cabinet decide that they're going to do this and go ahead with it and take a leap in the dark. Having taken this leap in the dark, it doesn't go so well because there's a balance of payments blowout, and then Menzies and his Cabinet have to introduce the credit squeeze measures, putting taxes up, etc., putting interest rates up to balance the external account. And that produces, for the first time since 1949, significant unemployment and almost causes the defeat of the Menzies government in 1960. But really, the Menzies government's able to successfully, in the end, get away with getting rid of import licensing for a number of reasons, one of which is the mining boom, which kicks off in 1960 because of Menzies' bold measure to get rid of the export embargo on iron ore. And these measures institute a new sort of more open era in the Australian economy. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Questions? Zach?
You mentioned briefly that some sort of Keynesian approaches to economic management had been introduced during the first Menzies government of 1939 to 41. Could you sort of elaborate on that? Because I know with Tom Switzer's presentation yesterday, there was a lot of talk about the extent to which Menzies inherited a Keynesian economic system and sort of benefited from that, but to what extent had he sort of experimented with that himself earlier on?
Yeah, good question. Some people regard Menzies' first wartime government in 1939 to 1941 as having really first introduced Keynesian principles. They're developed further by the Curtin and Chifley government, and by 1949, when Menzies comes back to power, Keynesian economic ideas are much more accepted than they were, say, in the 1930s, when they were regarded, like during the Scullin period, as quite unorthodox and radical and risky. But most of the senior officers in the Treasury by 1949-50 had accepted and been inculcated into Keynesian ideas.
I was just wondering, in relation to the horror budget of 1951, what was the public reaction to that? Was there an acceptance that it was necessary given the circumstances of the time, or was there a backlash? I mean, I just reflect on what we're going through at the moment with very difficult economic conditions that we haven't really experienced for many, many years. That we have that tension where the public do understand that there are things outside of Australia's control and the government's got to take various measures in order to combat inflation and debt and things like that. But how did things go in 51 with the fabulous budget?
I think there was a bit of a mix, really. There was, the word horror describes it, there was a sort of gasping at the kind of degree of severity of the measures. So there were people who criticised that degree of severity. But on the other hand, there were people who saw the wisdom and the prudence and the soundness of actually getting the economy in control. And one of the reasons for the economic success of the Menzies government was really, for the first time in decades, the government and the Treasury and trade were able to work together to achieve macroeconomic stability. Apart from a couple of blips like inflation in 1950-51, unemployment rising in 52 and then later in 1960, 61. But in general, you have this real degree of macroeconomic stability that underpins the political success of the Menzies government.
You've reminded me of something interesting about the people who claim credit for strategic development of Australia over time. And if I could just make a comment, I was at a conference in Collins Street during the time when Paul Keating had been branded the world's greatest treasurer, and Geoffrey Blaney was there, and part of Keating's claim at the time was that he was the guy who'd resurrected Australia's trade relationships, particularly with Japan. And Geoffrey Blaney took the stage and pointed out what you've just done, which is that it was actually Robert Menzies who reopened the trade relationship through iron ore with Japan in those early 1950s. So there's the political game played out, and it continues to do so, doesn't it?
Yeah, and those measures required a bit of courage. I mean, because Japan, this is only a decade or so after the end of the Pacific War, there's still a lot of resentment against Japan in the Australian community, and here you've got a government proposing a major trade deal between its former enemy.
Thank you very much for that paper. Policy obviously has many authors, and I wonder whether you could characterise Menzies' personal role, honing in a bit on Menzies himself and the man who came to office supporting private enterprise and implicitly at least some aspects of the market economy that were left in Australia at the time. Do you have a sense of how Menzies viewed these developments? I mean, we know later on when he had the Committee of Economic Inquiry, he could have denounced its recommendations as being inconsistent with the private enterprise system. Is this a case where Menzies himself was really deeply torn between his values and the circumstances and felt compelled to rely on public service advice as defining the public interest, or what was his personal involvement and reaction? Do you have any information on that?
Another reason for the political success of Menzies is being able to work with public service. The seven dwarfs, the group of seven people, including Crawford and Roland Wilson and others. So there was certainly a readiness to accept official advice when he needed to. With things like import licensing, none of them wanted to do this because it created political problems in the sense that no one wanted to have this regime. You get Liberal and Country Party branches criticising it. There were allegations of corruption of the regime, particularly in the late 1950s. But on the other hand, what else were they going to do? And how are they going to keep the economy in balance without doing that if they couldn't alter the currency? They didn't want to do that. For one thing, it's difficult. They've got to go to the IMF to ask permission. For another, they're not sure that they might have to change the currency back if they change it, move it downward. So they introduced it in 1952 and ratcheted upward and downward through the rest of the 1950s. And in the end, remove it. It doesn't go so well initially with the credit squeeze. But the 60s, it begins a whole new era for the Australian economy, the kind of economy that Menzies wanted in 1949, that had to wait a decade really